Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this session on geopolitics and global production networks. My name is Holger Görg from the Kiel Institute. We just had some technical problems, but now it seems to be working. So welcome all of you, and welcome to the two speakers that we have here. We'll start with Chenying, who's going to talk about industrial policies in multi-stage production. Then we have a discussion. So the setup is that we have 20 minutes for the presentation, 10 minutes for a discussant, and then 10 minutes or so for the floor to discuss the papers. Yeah, I look forward to it. Did you try it? Does it work? Yeah,
yep,
perfect. So we're all set up. So the floor is yours.
Thank you so much to the chair, and thank you everyone for coming to the session, and a big thank you to the organizer for including the paper in this program. So I'm Chenying from Singapore Management University. This is a joint work with Keith, Thierry here, and Marc from Harvard. So in this project, we're interested in studying how industrial policies will affect the global value chain, and specifically looking at battery EV industry as a quantitative application. So the project is mostly motivated by this US IRA implemented since 2022. But since this is a fast evolving industry, we see more and more policies in different continents, and EU as well, and all these tariff changes. So specifically in the US IRA, the consumers are given a subsidy when they purchase the EV of $7,500. But what's more interesting is that this consumer subsidy is contingent on where the car is assembled and where the battery, which is a key component in the EV, which accounts for more than 40% of the cost of producing an EV. So at least 40% or increasing to 80% by 2027 of the battery critical minerals has to be sourced from the US or FTA countries in order for the subsidy to qualify. And that content restriction also extends to battery component, which is a big focus of our paper. So right after the US IRA implemented, we see that the top 10 models in the US who becomes excluded from such IRA buyer credit are Hyundai Ioniq 5 and some BMW i4 and other models. So firms start to take action really quickly after the policy. For example, Hyundai started to add more models to the US assembly locations here in Georgia, as well as West Point by Kia. But not every firm decided to relocate. For example, Porsche will decide to stay in Germany, as we checked recently, and the BMW assemble for iX also will stay in Germany. So on top of the firm's margin in relocating assembly locations, they also adjust by product offerings, right? For example, Kia, on top of EV6, also decided to assemble EV9 at the US assembly, as well as Polestar also introduced the Polestar 3 in South California. So given all this anecdotal evidence and the policy motivation, in this paper, we're interested in investigating how the global value chain will be reshaped by these industry policies and these large-scale industry policies in the US and in other parts of the world. Particularly, taking into account the subsidy is now contingent on where the products are assembled and where the components are coming from. And so the main takeaway from our paper is that we find taking into account the endogenous selection of facility location matters a lot in evaluating industrial policies. And sometimes, depending on where firms decide to relocate, it may actually change the direction of the effect of such a policy. Okay. So let me jump into how we're going to solve this multi-product offering, multi-market, and multi-stage facility location problem. So as straightforward as the question seems to be, to answer such a question doesn't, we actually face some technical and empirical challenges. First, we need to find out what kind of trade-offs firms are facing when they decide to where to locate their suppliers, where to produce, and where to export their product. Right. So as the literature have found that the global value chain becomes more fragmented and longer, we're taking into account a snake-shaped supply chain with multi-stage production. However, when firms are thinking about along a global value chain, the location decision of each stage not only depend on the marginal cost of that particular stage, but also where is the upstream and downstream locations are. Okay. Moreover, since we're investigating these plant locations, they subject to a really high investment cost, and that leads to increasing returns to scale in such a problem. So different supply chain may share the same plant, and therefore creating these interdependencies across different paths of supply. Moreover, as we see just now, firms also adjust their product portfolio. So we also take into account that the firm's product offerings, they have multiple models, and they are thinking of a multiple market to enter. Okay? And in such a problem, there is another degree of interdependency coming from that suppose China is a big market with many EV models, and firms were more likely to locate their assembly plant near this larger market, and that actually indirectly benefit Southeast Asian countries. So we actually see a great increase in EV sales also in Thailand or Singapore. So we combining this multi-stage, multi-product, and multi-market, we call our problem a triple M and capacity facility location problem, or mu-flip. So the traditional way of solving such a high-dimensional combinatorial discrete choice problem is by I/O economists taking advantage of the firm's problem is either supermodular or submodular. So given that property, many of the location configurations can be eliminated without actual evaluation, therefore greatly reduce the dimension of the problem. However, in our setting, this problem is mu-flip is neither super or submodular. Why? Because within the same stage, plants are substitute. Right? So they're submodular. However, across the different stages, we see two aspects of complementarity. One is that across different production stages, there is a complementarity due to proximity or trade cost. Also, at the final stage, a larger consumer market will lead to more final production locations. Right? So there is also complementarity at the last stage. So we could not use this traditional way of solving such a problem. And we actually borrow a technique from the operations research literature by formulating this firm's problem into a mixed integer linear programming, and therefore we can leverage on some mathematical tools to solve such a linear programming problem. Okay. So let me visualize the firm's decision in this diagram. So here, different color indicates different EV models, and the firm simultaneously makes three decisions. One is where to offer different models in which market. So here, for example, as this blue model, firms decide to offer it in the West and the Central market, as indicated by the last row. And the second, and this market entry of models are subject to a market entry fixed cost. Firms also make a decision of where to build the plants. So here, what's the solid squares are the firm's where the firm's plants are, and the hollow square here is where the firms exit the market, exit the location, and this plant also subject to this plant fixed cost. And the last decision is to connecting this dot to find what is the optimal path to supply a model to different market, given what plants are activated. Okay. So we can write the firm's total profit function as such by aggregating the variable profit for every model M and the destination market N, and minus the 2 types of fixed costs. So as I said, firms make these 3 types of decisions. The Y here, 2 Ys, one is a product offering and one is a plant activation. They're all binary vectors. So we can actually introduce this optimal path selection by introducing this path assignment variable X. So therefore, we can actually transform this general firm's profit function into this mixed integer linear programming, where firms solve this continuous variable X and 2 integer variable YLK and YNN. So you may wonder that, how can we write this as a mixed integer linear programming? So one assumption we need to make is that the pi, the variable profit, is constant given a selected path, right? So all the blue variable here are known and a constant that firms take as a given when they solve their location and assignment problems. So one implication from this formulation is that a single path is going to be selected. Okay, so we solve this maximization problem subject to this constraint. This constraint actually respects this interdependency across the paths because, for example, when we look at the second constraint, it tells that a path can only pass a plant if that plant is actually open. Okay. So several assumptions for us to formulate this problem as a mixed integer linear programming. One is the marginal cost is constant, and therefore, given a constant marginal cost for a specific path, we can write down the variable profit, which does not depend on other path decisions, right? And also, because the formulation implies a single sourcing, that means we need to make 2 more assumptions, which is that the inputs are perfectly substituted. Also, the plants are incapacitated, so that is consistent with a single sourcing implication. Okay, so when we bring this model to the simulation, we first want to see in a simulated world, flat world, how would the industry policies affect the firm's decisions on global value chain. So we actually simulate a single model firm with 3 stages of production and the last stage consumers, with randomly 40 locations chosen on a 2-dimensional space. We homogenize different marginal cost of production, but only leave the distance as a factor to determine where to open the plant. Also simulate some fixed cost of market entry and the facility open. We give the northern consumers a higher demand, and the subsidy will lower consumer price. So what we see here is on the left side, that is the world without any policy shock. We see that because the North have a higher demand, and therefore firms build more production chains on the north side to serve the consumers, some consumers, by paying the fixed cost of market entry, and there is one cluster at the south. And when we shock this simulated flat world in the central location by giving it a consumer subsidy, we see that more consumers enter in the central, and the firms build a new production chain at the central. And that increases the plant as well as the EV adoption share. We also see a spillover effect in terms of the firms decide to move the southern production to further south, and therefore to serve more southern and more consumers. And the second policy is, on top of this direct consumer subsidy, suppose we give it a condition, the subsidy is only qualified if there is the final assemble is made in the central. Then what we see on the right is that the firms decide to move or relocate this final assembly location, this black square, to the central, right, in order to qualify such rule. And however, we see that because such move leads to further distance from some of the southern consumers, and therefore, if you calculate the EV adoption overall, it's actually a reduction compared to a pure demand subsidy. And if we're further restricting the supply chain by contingent on the entire value chain, we see that firms no longer find such move profit maximizing. So they would rather stick with the original formulation. So if you still remember, on the right-hand side, that graph is exactly the same as the pure demand subsidy case. However, because in this case, many of the consumers now cannot enjoy the subsidy because the cars are produced at non-qualified regions, and therefore the overall EV adoption share actually reduced, leads to that content restrictions actually becomes counterproductive. Okay. So lastly, we use the real-world data in the EV industry to estimate all the marginal costs of production and the fixed costs in this industry so that we can do counterfactual in the real world. And the estimation follows a three-step procedure. One is that conditional on the active facilities we observe in the data, we can run Nazi logit regressions to estimate the relative marginal cost of production at different stages as estimated with the fixed effect. Also, we can estimate the trade cost for every stage as a function of observables such as distance, tariff, border effect, and so on. And taking that estimated marginal cost, we go to the second step where we estimate some of the demand elasticities and the car quality or car appeal, specific to each model market. And lastly, we're going to estimate the fixed cost parameters, fixed cost of model entry, and also fixed cost of plant activation by matching some of the moments of the data. So in the first step, when we estimate these sourcing regressions, the fixed effect denote these relative cost differences across different countries in different production stages. So on the left, we see that at the cell stage, the finest units for battery that go into a car, the least cost producer or the most efficient producer here is China. And from the European countries are UK, Poland, and Hungary. So Japan is also a big battery producer, and Korea. And so unfortunately, since here we're presenting in Berlin, in Germany, we see actually Germany here is really high cost in producing cells. So when I look into data, I find that the key car manufacturer in Germany, such as BMW, Volkswagen, or Mercedes, they actually use the battery cells from factories in Poland and Hungary that is owned by Samsung and LG. So the only cell or battery manufacturer have a German plant is actually a Microvast. It's a US firm, but actually have a plant right here in Berlin. So, but knowing that our data here, the regressions is run only until 2023, so it hasn't taken into account this, Tesla opening new plant here, or it's not a dynamic model that forecast the future involvement in Germany and European countries. And on the right-hand side is the relative cost rank of assembly. So we see the least cost producer assembler here is Mexico, followed by Korea and Belgium here, and Japan. some of the actually high-cost assemblers are China. Okay. Okay, so this is just to show that after estimating all the marginal costs and the fixed costs, we actually can fit pretty well into the data in terms of where the product or the plant are and also the intensive margin on the flows. Okay, and lastly, we plug in our estimated parameters into the counterfactual and run these 3 policies. And we find that a similar story as what we see in the flat world, here in the real world, let's now focus on America, the first row, which is the number of production lines in America for the assembly stage. Right? So here we see that if you have a pure demand subsidy, the number of production lines in America increase, as we see in the blue dot. And if it's contingent on assembly, then more plants is going to be relocated to America, and therefore you see a vast increase in the number of production lines shown by the red dot here. Okay. However, if it's contingent on the whole value chain, firms no longer willing to relocate facing such a high cost in America, and therefore the number of production lines actually reduce even below the pure demand subsidy case. As for sales, that is the triangle. We see that more content, stricter content restrictions leads to increasing number of sales opened in America, but that is relatively a smaller margin. But what's more interesting is we see that for the first 2 cases, when the sale is not contingent upon, Asia actually also benefited from the subsidy in America. Why? Because Asia is, as we see just now, China is a really low-cost battery maker, right? So when there's more assembly opened in America, where do they source? They actually source the batteries in Asia. So that probably gives some justification in why the IRA now is restricting on batteries cannot come in from China. And so that is some complementarity across different stages. And when we see more Asia sales in the triangle, we also see more Asia assembly in the square. And lastly, we actually, surprisingly, we found a substitution between Europe assembly plants and America assembly plants. So indicated by the red square in Europe is actually reducing a lot. Okay. And so just to conclude, will there be any environmental effect? So we see again here, if the restriction is very strict on the entire value chain, the blue dot here, the EV indicated by the EV expenditure is actually the least among all 3 policies. So we find this increasing restriction on the supply chain actually attenuates both production as well as environmental benefit. So let me just conclude here. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion and also other questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chenying, also for the meeting, for the excellent timekeeping. And now we have Nuriye to give us her thoughts.
So, hello everyone. It's great to be here. So, I'm Nuriye Bilgin, and today I will be discussing this very interesting, timely paper. So in the recent news, we are always seeing some announcements for the plant closures from the auto industries. They are mostly these industries mostly hire lots of people in their plants. So it's an important news for not only for economists but also for policymakers. Furthermore, we are witnessing for the first time this type of events, closure of these plants, even in Germany. So with this large number of employees and also dependent direct and indirect suppliers, this paper takes a perspective for the industrial policies. And the reason is why, a natural question is why these auto industries are closing their plants, or they are shifting to the other places, or other production sites. So the first reason would be the decreasing in the value, but most importantly, their struggle to transit for the electrical vehicles. So this paper focuses on the electrical vehicles and asks two main questions. First, how do these firms endogenously form their supply chains for the electrical vehicles? And furthermore, in case of subsidies and policies, what will be their spatial distribution of different stages of production? So the battery requirements in production makes these electrical vehicles different than the combustion engines. They require more complex value chains, they are more technologically intensive, and also we know that there is a cost advantage of China, because these batteries require lithium, cobalt, and nickel in their production. Furthermore, the transportation of these batteries is not also simple. And given this background, we also know that there is a rise in the protectionist policies worldwide, and especially for the US IRA. So given this setting, with this multi-stage production, with multi-models, firms have to decide in this model where to build their plants and whom to source from. So that will be depending on the first marginal cost and also the variable cost depending on the upstreamness and the downstreamness of each different production stages of the electrical vehicles. And also they test what will be the impact of consumer credits on the supply chain's distribution for the electrical vehicles. But most of the time this type of endogenous production formation problems is not straightforward, because each of these decisions are interdependent. So there are many alternative locations, many alternative choices. So firms have to solve these discrete choice problems. And most of the time they are not computationally feasible. Firms have to make some assumptions, or there wouldn't be any different stages. So in this paper, we see that this multi-stage production cost is solved through the Operations Research LP, and they offer a new, more flexible way to do this, which doesn't require any parameter restrictions. And we see that for the electrical vehicles, for the pro EV markets have more buyers like Norway, Sweden, and China. And actors along the value chain, especially for the battery cells, are single source. But most importantly, these cells also travel long distance. In this setting, there will be also a high fixed cost for the battery plants. These battery plants are main difference between the combustion engine production. So they are mostly technologically intensive. So in this type of setting, this is different than the multi-sourcing models that we are used to. Firms are not only go for the lowest cost. So these electrical vehicles would be produced in 3 stages. And firms have to decide where to locate their facilities. First, they can start to buy their batteries from China, and then they can locate the second stage in Indonesia, and they can end up in Mexico. But there are always different L's. And across these different locations, there would be a different specific production path. It would be changing depending on the location. So firms have to choose where to open their sites with the activation problems, also the assignment problem, depending on the path between each stages. So there would be many, many alternatives. And this variable cost would be depending on the production path, but the fixed cost would be location specific. But I didn't understand why this is not so stage specific, because these batteries might require some more technological infrastructure than the assembly stage. So maybe there can be some heterogeneity across these stages. So in this type of setting, firms will optimize their profits with choosing the most efficient path. So we also see some simulations with different regions, including northern middle and southern regions. In the northern regions, the demand increases with latitude, so we expect that northern regions consume more EVs, with the marginal cost and the fixed cost. In the baseline scenario, there would be 3 places, but northern regions have more plants due to their higher demand. But if there are some subsidies to the middle, then in that case, there will be shifts to the plant locations and also the market share. And there will be some new assembly plants. But one of my favorite parts in this paper is what will happen if there is a stricter process, if there is something like US IRA or 100% domestic supply chain. Then we see that it will reduce the EV market due to their increase in the compliance costs. So it will be reducing their intended benefits, these stricter policies. And then by using their linear programming setting, they have the CS demand function and the complex production function, and with different path codes, depending on the wages, trade codes, and the shocks. This is also one of my favorite parts. So it shows the stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. Each of the stage have interdependency depending on the stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. Firms, by having the assembly location in Mexico, has to decide the trade cost or some tariffs from the Indonesia or Malaysia, and then from the first stage, they also have to decide where to locate their batteries. So this shows us really directly the endogeneity of the supply chain, and there are numerous examples with different types of shocks. And we see that once you go to the downstream, once you go to the final stage of the production, you have to, all of these costs are iterating through the final stage. And it's also a good way to represent the shock propagation, which stage you are having the shock and what will happen through the final part. These shocks will not die in this type of setting. And also, what would be different for these 3 stages for the ICs and the EVs can be a good question, because they have this data, maybe having some different shocks or some technological constraints. So they are using a nested logic, using these costs by the upstream parts and integrate in each of these downstream stages, one by one. So we see that with the distance, this downstreamness effect will decrease, and the RTAs are stronger for the electric vehicles. And also, final way to show that there are some places you can have these cells, but there are more places you can do the assemblies. For instance, you can do the assembly in Mexico or Turkey, but for the cells, there are only some specific and very limited amount of locations. And once you go step by step, you see this in the paper. I find it very realistic and very interesting for this industry. And for the packs, maybe there is some high heterogeneity across Europe for Germany, for France, and Italy. So it's not due to some trade costs, but it would be very interesting to explore this fact. And finally, the authors use these demand shifters by comparing the prices and sales of the combustion engines with the electrical vehicles. I find it very smart. So we see that the relative appeal of the electrical vehicles. And once you go through this, even for the difference in the demands, we see some environmental stringencies. There are also some reflecting these climate policies of these industries. Maybe not to relate to paper, but it can be used at different type of environmental stringency across different countries. So I really like this paper. I think we have learned a lot. It's very timely, and it offers a new way to solve these discrete choice problems. So I'm looking forward to the future of this agenda. It's a great paper.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nuriye, for starting the discussion. So we have time for questions from the floor. I might also stand up so I can see everyone here. Are there any questions? Yeah, start here.
Thank you. Very interesting paper, Daniel Gross from Bocconi University. Actually, it's a question and remark together regarding your application to the IRA. I just wanted to mention two peculiarities which very often are not taken into account in empirical applications. The first one is that actually for most European producers, the requirement to have the car assembled in North America does not apply because of the leasing assumption. If the car is leased, and most high-priced cars are leased. And the second point, is, for which I have not yet found a good explanation, is that actually if you look at the number of subsidies given in the United States for the acquisition of battery electric vehicles and the sales, then you see that the IRA was given to only 1/5 of the total sales of BEVs. And most cars, BEVs sold in the US, are still assembled in the United States or in North America. Right? So I don't have a good explanation for that, but that should perhaps influence also your empirical results and the estimate of what impact the actual implementation of the IRA might have on plant location and so on.
Thank you so much for a question about the first one, which is about leasing cars. Yeah, indeed, the IRA actually have many more details than just the contingent consumer subsidy I mentioned. For example, a lesser requirement for used cars and like leasing cars and so forth. We currently do not, I believe, have data on leasing cars, but I believe that's a really interesting dimension to look into. And the second question you have about the share of models that qualify that subsidy is actually a really small share of the sales. That's also what we find in the counterfactual analysis, and actually a key reason for driving our result, because if you remember, one graph that I show is that with the contingent consumer subsidy, the number of production lines increased dramatically in the US. However, the EV expenditure actually goes down. Right? So that this dichotomy between these two actually shows that the share of models qualify for such subsidy is actually a really small fraction, right? And therefore, although many more models are added, but in terms of the total EV sales is actually less than just a pure consumer subsidy because many models are not qualified for such. Yeah, thank you. So we actually plan to draw a figure that could graph how many percentage of the models will be qualified in different policy scenarios. I think that will be filling the gap between these two figures.
Any more questions or comments at this stage? No, so perhaps during the coffee break or the lunch break. Then let me thank again Chenying for the very exciting presentation and Nuriye for your comments. And we'll move on to the next paper, which is on global value chains in a world of uncertainty and automation, and it's presented by Dalia Marin.
So this is joint work with Marius, Faber, Kemal, Kilic, Gleb, Kozliakov, and myself. The question that this paper raises is, can uncertainty together with automation explain the trend reversal in openness in the world economy? First, to the trend reversal, this is by now well known that since the global financial crisis, openness is stagnating. While before there was hyper-globalization between 1980 and 2008. So we measure uncertainty by the World Uncertainty Index developed by here, and this uncertainty index counts the share of the word uncertain or its variance in the Economist Intelligence Unit country reports. So here we see the uncertainty by the rosy bars, and what you see here clearly is that the uncertainty has become unusually high since the global financial crisis. So higher uncertainty creates a greater risk of default of an input goods delivery. And if these uncertainty shocks happened more often, as they did after the global financial crisis, remember we had the European debt crisis, Brexit, US-China trade war, COVID, and the Russian attack on Ukraine. So when these uncertainty shocks happen more often, firms are likely to start to reconsider their supplier relationship. At the same time, robots have become cheaper and more sophisticated. So automation has made substantial advances, so they are now able to perform tasks that have been previously been undertaken in developing countries. And at the same time, the central banks have lowered their interest rates in order to fight the financial crisis, lowering the financing conditions for firms, lowering the cost of capital relative to labor. So the research question we are asking is, does uncertainty in developing countries cause reshoring in global supply chains to high-income countries, and does automation play a facilitating role? So in the theoretical literatures, there is the effect of uncertainty and of robots is ambiguous. The effect of uncertainty on supply chains depends whether firms view the domestic or the foreign economy more prone to shocks. So if both are risky, they diversify. If home is less risky, they reshore. And the effect of robots on supply chains depends on the displacement effect and the productivity effect. The displacement effect, so whether robots substitute for foreign workers, lowering the need for global supply chains, that's the displacement effect, or whether robots increase productivity, increasing output, increasing the need for more imported inputs from developing countries, that's the productivity effect. So in order for these ambiguities in the theoretical literature, we want to put some numbers on these questions. The literature so far has looked at uncertainty and the effect of uncertainty on international trade on the one hand, and the effect of robots on offshoring on the other, but no paper so far has looked at these combined effects of uncertainty and robots at the same time, and that's basically the contribution of this paper. So let me come now to testing the effect of uncertainty and robots on reshoring. So the data we use for global supply chains are the world input-output data, and these data consists of intermediate input flows in 18 developed countries and 17 developing countries in 19 industries, and uncertainty is measured by the World Uncertainty Index, as I already described. And then we use, for robots, we use the robot replaceability, that an instrument for robot adoption that has been suggested by Gretz and Michaels, and it's basically the industry share of occupations in the US in the 1980s with skills that can be replaced by robots. So let me come to the empirical strategy. So our estimating equation is the dependent variable is reshoring, and this reshoring variable is the use of inputs, of domestic inputs in high-income country I, in industry J, in the time period T, relative to imported inputs from developing countries, and we relate this to an exposure variable that measures uncertainty in developing countries. So let me explain this a little further. So this exposure variable to uncertainty in developing countries is basically capturing uncertainty in developing countries at the country level, taken from the World Uncertainty Index by that I just described, and we weight this uncertainty at the country level with the trade link between the high-income country I and the developing country J. So this trade link, alpha, measures the share of inputs in total inputs, the share of inputs from a particular developing country K in total inputs used in the high-income country I. So the stronger is the trade link, the stronger is the effect of an uncertainty in the developing countries on the high-income country. Then we look at, we relate it to robot replaceability, as I already described, and we are particularly interested in the interaction term between the exposure to developing countries uncertainty and robot replaceability. So let me come to our results. Now let me move to the third column, which is our preferred specification that we are going to use as a benchmark for the following analysis. So basically what this column shows, so the dependent variable is domestic inputs relative to developing countries' inputs, and the interaction term, the exposure to developing countries uncertainty times robot adoption, is highly significant and positive, while the uncertainty itself has no significant effect on reshoring. So basically what these results suggest is that firms exposed to an uncertainty shock in robotized industries are doing the reshoring because they have the robots available that can replace the tasks that have been undertaken by the developing country, while in non-robotized industries, we don't see this effect, we don't see reshoring. Okay, so higher uncertainty in developing countries increases the relative use of domestic inputs, but only in highly robotized industries. Now, our reshoring variable increases with the use of more domestic inputs, but it also increases with the use of fewer imported inputs. So in order to see which one of these, or both, in order to see which one of these two are driving our reshoring variable, we undertake in column 2. So what we do is we fix developing country inputs and let the reshoring variable only capture domestic changes in domestic inputs. And what this column 2 shows is that there is no effect. We don't see the interaction term is not significant. In column 3, we do the opposite. We fix the domestic inputs and let the reshoring variable capture only developing countries' inputs. And what we see here is clearly that the interaction term increases and has almost the same size as in our benchmark equation that I showed you in the first table. So basically, the results suggest that uncertainty shocks lead to fewer imported inputs from developing countries, but not into an increase in domestic inputs. And that suggests that firms reorganize and move to produce the input in-house rather than to reshore to domestic input suppliers. That's not a result that we actually expected. So a possible reason why they move to produce the input in-house when they are faced with an uncertainty shock is because it is costly to find new suppliers when firms invest in a supplier relationship. So moving production in-house may be a less costly alternative. Another reason why this might happen is because in uncertain times, firms need more control, and so producing in-house delivers this more control. Now, in this graph, we show that the reshoring response to uncertainty more than triples after the global financial crisis. Now, let me explain this. So, what this graph shows are point estimates of the interaction term between the uncertainty in developing countries and robot replaceability. So we ran these regressions before the global financial crisis and after the financial crisis. And what we see is that the estimated coefficient of the interaction terms triples after the global financial crisis. So possible reasons for this is that there was a higher risk aversion following the traumatic experience after the global financial crisis, advances in automation which made robots more efficient, and the low interest rate environment that firms faced, which made robots less costly after the global financial crisis. What we also show is that the results are not driven by single industries or countries. What you see here, for example, is, again, the estimated interaction term between the uncertainty shock and robot replaceability. And on the left side, we individually exclude each high-income country and look whether this interaction term changes. And basically, nothing happens. So even when we exclude Germany, which is a hub of global supply chains, this interaction term hardly drops. On the right side, we show when we exclude each of the industries, and again, we don't find any effect. Here, we show the same for the developing countries, so the point estimates do not differ when we individually exclude one developing countries at a time. So for instance, when we exclude China, nothing much happens. So the results are robust to that. So we don't find any effect on nearshoring. I won't have time to look at this. So let me say a word on diversification. So diversification is now the big mantra. You know, you respond to uncertainty by diversifying. So we looked at that, and our dependent variable is now not reshoring, but the Herfindahl index of concentration of input suppliers in developing countries. And what you see here is, so if there is more diversification, we will expect that this concentration ratio goes down, and basically we don't see it. So the uncertainty shock has no effect on diversification. Again, this suggests that there are high costs of finding new suppliers. high cost of finding new suppliers. This is inconsistent with the theoretical literature that has suggested when you have a hold-up problem, you have a high cost of finding new suppliers, and evidently this is present in the data. So we have major threats to identification in this setup, and I want to mention two. So basically we have reverse causality. So reshoring may affect uncertainty in developing countries rather than the other way around. And we tackle this problem by using the narrative approach and the small economy approach. So let me explain. The narrative approach is an approach that has been developed by Roma and Roma in the context of the macro literature. And it basically, they looked at the effect of fiscal and monetary policy. So we are adopting this concept, and what we do is we use only uncertainty spikes in developing countries for which the narrative around the event suggests that these spikes were plausibly exogenous. And we take this narrative, what caused the event, from the country report of the Economist Intelligence Unit. So here are examples of narratives of uncertainty spikes. For example, look at Brazil. What we use in our analysis is the point where in 2013, in which the Petrobras corruption scandal unfolds and nothing else. Similarly, we look at China at a spike when Xi Jinping was taking over the leadership. And other examples. So that gives you the flavor of what we are using. And then we rerun the regression again using this adjusted uncertainty exposure variable in developing countries. And what we get is basically that the results do not change at all. So the estimated coefficient of the interaction term is almost identical. Then in the small open economy approach, we take the idea that small developed countries are less able to cause uncertainty in developing countries. So small developed countries are price takers on world markets. So we exclude the 5 largest developed country destinations for developing countries' inputs. And this in our data is the US, Germany, South Korea, France, and Italy, and they account for almost 70% of all imported inputs from developing countries. And we rerun the regression again. We see in column 3 that our interaction term is significant now at the 5% level, and it has dropped in size, but still we get the result. So we are pretty sure that we estimate that our estimated interaction term is not driven by reverse causality, by the effect that reshoring causes uncertainty in developing countries. Now, since I have only 20 minutes, I cannot go through all the tests we do. We do a battery of tests that tests for threats to identifications in shift chair design. Our exposure variable is the shift chair instrument, and basically, we show that our results are all robust. So our shock is as good as randomly assigned, and our shock are not driven by noise, and so on. So let me stop here.
Thanks very much, Dalia, for the talk. And we now have Lei Li to lead the discussion.
Okay, thanks so much for the organizers to give me this opportunity to discuss this paper. This is a really interesting paper on the impact of economic uncertainty and automation on developed countries' import sourcing decisions from developing countries. And the main finding of this paper is that they find that the economic uncertainty shocks will affect developed countries' sourcing decisions by increase their relative domestic input share. However, this effect only happens when industrial robots has made this economically feasible. And regarding the main contribution of this paper is that, empirically speaking, this paper interact economic uncertainty index with automation index, and to show that the joint effect of these two on domestic input source, on developed countries' input sourcing decisions. And regarding identification, this paper has done a lot of work and great job in addressing several threats to identification regarding the use of shift share instrument following the recent literature. For the sake of time, I will directly come to my comments. The first one is to think about the story and the key mechanism. That is, how does economic uncertainty shock will affect countries' sourcing decisions? My prior would be that economic uncertainty will likely to increase the relative domestic input share. And however, in the paper, the main key finding in the baseline regression in column 1 and column 2 shows that actually there is no effect of economic uncertainty on domestic input share. It's only the interaction term that matters. This finding was very surprising to me at the first glance. So I keep thinking what could be plausible reasons to explain this puzzle. So I came up with some explanation. The first one is regarding mechanism. So in this paper, Dalia also mentioned, say, Brexit, US-China trade war, COVID, Russian-Ukraine war. These economic uncertainty-related shocks will probably increase developed countries' domestic import share. I'm fully convinced with this story because, for example, for the US-China trade war, higher tariff imposed by both countries will increase the trade cost, and which will lead to, say, the reduction of import from each other. And regarding COVID and Russian-Ukraine war, this caused supply chain disruptions, which of course will also affect a country's sourcing decision. But however, if we look at the data regarding what the uncertainty index actually measures, for example, Bulgaria's decision to enter EU or some countries' decision in entering into the Schengen area, I feel that this uncertainty may not necessarily affect or at least reduce developed countries' import from these countries, because this uncertainty is about positive uncertainty in the sense that they may increase developed countries' imports from these countries. And other shocks include, say, corruptions or scandals, and their effect could be a bit ambiguous. So I'm thinking about whether in the main regression you can try to disentangle different sources of economic uncertainty to focus on the uncertainty that destructive for trade flows. A second thing is about the sample period. So from the really nice figure from the table, which is a red bar, we can see that the economic uncertainty index increased dramatically since 2015. This is kind of due to a number of events as mentioned in this paper. However, for the sample period that this paper is actually using is from 2000 to 2014. So maybe the major economic shocks are not captured in the sample. And this may also partly explain the significant results. And the third thing that came to my mind is about the possible control. So you can see that the paper focus on period and country fixed effect, but there's no industry fixed effect since the data vary by time, country, and industry. You may consider to control for the broad industry category. Another thing is that maybe you also consider controlling for country period fixed effect, because as you mentioned, after the financial crisis, some central banks in certain countries have relatively loose monetary policy, and this is something vary by country and by sample period, by time. And that's about the first thing regarding thinking about why economic uncertainty itself has no effect on input sourcing decision. And second comment is regarding the measurement and identification. So the key measurement of uncertainty exposure measurement is about the weighted average of country-specific uncertainty. And also I'm thinking about for different sectors, for different industries, their sensitivity to external uncertainty shocks could be different. Say if a sector or for a certain industry, the goods are more substitutable across different producers, across different sourcing countries, and then they might be more sensitive to external shocks or less sensitive. So I'm just trying to nail down to see whether you can see heterogeneous effect to make the channel or mechanism more solid. And also another question related to identification is that since currently, the key results come from the interaction term, which is an interaction between uncertainty index and the automation index. So if this is the case, when you consider alternative stories, other measurement of uncertainty index should also be interacted with the automation index to see whether the key results for the interaction term still holds. The last few comments is about these are relatively minor comments. One is about the global value chain. So this paper, the sample focuses on developed countries' import decisions mainly from developing countries. Just thinking about the external validity. So why you focus on these specific settings and whether the story still holds to the south-to-south trade. In the current version, the paper, the authors explain that one of the reasons is for identification concerns because the economic shocks in developing countries are unlikely to be driven by developed countries' certain economic actions. I buy this argument, but maybe it's good to provide more reasoning why you focus on these specific subsamples. And last minor point is about nearshore. So instead of restricting the sample, another way to do it to interact the index with certain countries which are neighbors, and then you will have, say, more power and you have a good reference point. Yeah, but these are minor points. So for the sake of time, I will quickly sum up. And this paper tackles a very important question on the effect of economic uncertainty and automation's joint effect on developed countries' sourcing decisions. And also the paper has done a lot of work regarding addressing the shift share instrument concerns. And this paper is really well written and it's easy to read, and I learned a lot from reading this paper. And hope the comments are helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lei, for your insightful discussion. Would you like to respond to some of them now, or shall we take some questions first? Okay, then let's take some questions. There's one here already.
All right, very nice paper. I enjoyed that a lot. It's because like the main ideas on reshoring, I was wondering if you like do the analysis on trade uncertainty in particular. Would you get like stronger effects? Because the stories on reshoring, I would imagine trade uncertainty would be like more, even like induce more stronger effects, but yeah.
Thank you. There was another question.
Yes, thank you, Holger. Thank you, Dalia. I think this is very plausible, what you present, very believable. I think I have two questions, actually three. One is, we have uncertainty about trade policy, let's say, no? But we can observe trade policy as well. So why not have tariffs or the increase in protectionism as measured by the Global Trade Alert in your regressions? That's the first thing. The second is, in Gene Grossman's paper, the emphasis is really on relative uncertainty. No? So is one country becoming more uncertain relative to the other? And so if you want to tie that a little bit more closely to Gene's theoretical work, you might want to have relative uncertainty maybe in the regressions. And the third question is, Of course, reshoring into a industrialized country like Germany is expensive because wages are high. And of course, you can escape that wage problem with robots, but you could also think about reshoring into less uncertain places where wages are low and you don't have to have robots because there is a competitive possibility to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Polish Economic Institute, Mark. Thank you for the paper. I wanted to build on this last question, actually, because I believe there is a difficulty in differentiating between reshoring and nearshoring for the European Union. European Union member states have common tariffs, and in that sense, for example, trade policy is common. So differentiating between Germany and, for example, Poland might be difficult, also wages issue. And if I am correct from your slides, I have seen that as developing countries, you mentioned high-income countries like Poland, Czech Republic, and other European Union member states. So here I also wanted to ask if you believe that it might change also the results if you take European Union as a whole for reshoring idea. Thank you.
Okay, maybe do you like to take a few minutes to reply, and then we'll see whether there are more questions.
Okay, so thank you, Laili, for the comments. Thank you. Yeah, we were puzzled as well why uncertainty alone doesn't have any effect, because in the literature that I cited about trade, uncertainty and trade, uncertainty does have an effect. And I agree, our data go from 2000 to 2014 and do not cover actually the big spikes in uncertainty like COVID or the Russian invasion in Ukraine. So, yes, so basically our data cover in particular the European debt crisis. So we thought that might be the reason why we don't see that much of an effect. But I have to say that the uncertainty spikes we have in the developing countries, there is lots of variation, and even there is lots of variation between in these countries. When you look at our figure 2, you see the variation. And so therefore, I'm pretty sure we capture here something that is important. Okay, so this is one point. And the other point is we are using as control, we use all possible fixed effects. We have a robustness table that looks at all possible fixed effects, and the results do not change. We have it in the appendix. The results do not change when we do this. Okay, so why not use trade uncertainty or tariffs or uncertainty about trade policy? Now, actually, we have a table where we have different controls that I didn't show because I didn't want to bombard you with too many tables. So, in this table where we have lots of controls, we have tariffs. We actually have the actual tariffs, and the tariff variable leads to more reshoring, but it's not significant. But we know this from the trade literature. The tariffs often are not significant. So in our case, it's not significant. It's not significant as well. Now, the aim of our paper was not, Gabriel, was not to test the Grossman theoretical model. I mean, it was inspired by the theory. We wanted really to put to the ambiguity that is in the theoretical literature, some data and empirics, what the data show. Yeah, reshoring is expensive. It's interesting. We have a table that I didn't discuss, where we find that, that firms will respond to an uncertainty shock by relocating production to other developed countries if they cannot replace the task from the developing country by a robot. So what they do is they relocate to other high-income countries which are perceived as less uncertain. But they reshore actually from other high-income countries when they can replace the task from the developing country with a robot. So we have this interesting finding that when the uncertainty shock from the developing country hits, firms reshore, even from the high-income countries, when they can replace the task from the developing country with a robot, but they relocate to high-income countries if they cannot replace the task by a robot. And we have the finding that actually reshoring from Eastern Europe is also taking place with more uncertainty. So we don't find that firms relocate more to Eastern Europe. Maybe they do it now, but our data go until 2014. But I have to say that our data go until 2014 is actually a nice feature of the data because we don't have the trade conflict between Trump and the US and all these things that might lead to more reshoring. But what we show is actually even before all these trade conflicts started to happen, we already see the reshoring. So we are pretty sure that this is going to happen even more so when geopolitical uncertainty increases in times of war. And why not look at the European economy as a whole? I mean, why should we throw away variation that we have in the data for individual countries? For example, in particular for Germany, which is a hub of global supply chain in Europe. So we didn't see this as a good exercise to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Dalia. We have time for a last question, if there is any. Yeah, Peter.
Thank you. Peter Eppinger from Tübingen. So I also like the presentation a lot, very, very interesting. So maybe two quick points. One is about this reshoring trend in general. So you didn't show us how the index actually, how this dependent variable evolves over time, and maybe it's just a slowdown in offshoring, and is reshoring really happening from those countries? Like, it would be nice to see that. And then so that's already in the global trend is in your period fixed effects, so maybe only some of it is country specific. And you use a country specific 1-year spike, which might go away again, so maybe it's interesting to look at maybe initial and end period, like 5-year windows, to see the average uncertainty. Did that go up on average in a long difference? And then you might see like a general increase in uncertainty by country, because if it's a 1-year spike, reshoring might not happen that quickly, right? So it could be, if there's a general uncertainty in the country level environment going up, that would be maybe more interesting. And final thing, since your story has very important implications on kind of implications of on labor markets in developed economies, right? So they bring back, but they don't bring back the jobs, right? So it would be interesting to see, like, as dependent variables, what happens to labor, what happens to really use of robots as a dependent variable in those countries. Is that driven by? Is there really reshoring happening into kind of robot use? Thanks.
One idea. I don't know if you have checked whether the result holds differently when you compare countries within the Eurozone and countries outside the Eurozone, because in the in the paper that I have done with Guizzo and others on economic policy, what it turned out is that within the Eurozone, because of the control only on one policy and not the other, and etc., the depth type of uncertainty that you focus on in that period affected more the relocation of firms because of the sort of straitjacket effect, whereas outside the Eurozone the effect was lower. That would be interesting to check.
Okay, thank you. Some brief answers, perhaps?
We didn't look at this question. Yeah, we didn't look at this question. Okay, so what we do is we use 2-year changes in our variables. So it's not the 1 year, but 2-year changes. We also looked in a particular on long differences. I think we got this. I don't remember, but we then decided to look at 2-year differences. So what happens to labor markets? We didn't look at this question, but you are right. If reshoring happens when the task is replaced by robots, we are not expecting that reshoring has big employment effects. That's true, but we didn't look at this question empirically because we didn't look at this question empirically.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for participating, and yeah, we show our appreciation. Thanks to Dalia and Lei. And now we have a half-an-hour coffee break, and after the coffee break you might have noticed that we have an expanded choice set. There are 3 sessions to choose from in the 2 big rooms that you already know, and then there's this K1, it's conference room 1, which is just to the right over there of the other big room, the name I forgot. Okay. Half-an-hour coffee break, 11:20, back to the sessions. Thank you.